Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Julie Hodges, a leading expert in change management, a professor at Durham University Business School, and a former consultant with PwC, where she supported major organizations through complex business transformations. Julie brings a wealth of real world and academic insight into how change really happens inside an organization. Today, we'll be diving into a book called People-Centric Organizational Change Engaging Employees with Business Transformation. A practical and thoughtful guide to leading change, managing resistance, and putting people at the heart of transformation. So, Julie, thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm really excited to deep dive into our conversation with you on change management.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for the invitation to join your podcast, Sid.
Thank you so much. So let's kick off. If you don't mind giving us a little bit intro about your personal background and what really led you into the field of change management.
Yeah, sure. So before joining academia, I spent 20 years working in the business world. I began my career working for the British Council, and I spent most of 10 years working overseas with locally engaged staff, which was just incredible to be part of the different cultures. And whilst I was working with the British Council, I also did a part-time PhD, which looked at the impact of change on levels of stress among managers. And I suppose that's what kicked off my initial interest. Once I left the British Council and I went to join a startup company called Vertex, and I set up a head of commercial consultancy team there. And then I was headhunted to go and work with PwC. So I went to work with PwC and spent a number of years working on major organizational transformations with a number of the FTSE 100 companies. And then I went to work in the financial sector with what was at the time RBS. Obviously, that bank has now changed its name to NatWest. So I moved from being an external consultant to being an internal consultant. So I suppose my experience working in business is all about focusing on leading and managing transformations. After working with RBS for a couple of years, I realized that actually I didn't want to be part of a corporate environment anymore. I wanted to wake up in the morning and do something that I was really passionate about. And I'd always really enjoyed teaching, facilitating workshops. I'd always enjoyed research and writing. Well, that's when I moved into academia. And for me now today, I have the best job ever because I get to teach, to do consultancy work, to do research, and to write books in the field of organizational change. And particularly, as you pointed out, I specialize within the area of people-centric change.
Yes, amazing. Can't wait to deep dive on that. So, what was your experience like leading change for the first time? Were there any key lessons or surprises that you can think of?
Yeah, I think, I was in my 20s when I was first involved in a major transformation. So I didn't have a lot of experience at that time. So it's very much about learning as I went along. And I think initially I was very focused on the process element of change itself. What I quickly learned is yes, you need process side when it comes to business transformations, but importantly is also having a focus on the people element as well.
Nice. So, maybe key lessons or maybe some mistakes you can think of when you were leading that change?
Yeah, I think the key lessons learned were about making sure that key stakeholders are involved in a transformation from as early a stage as possible, and that they are involved in making any decisions that are going to impact on their job and their ways of working and behaving in an organization. And I think also I learned about the importance of communicating with key stakeholders, whether they're internal or they're external, and also learn about what's really important, I think, is to take time to actually learn as well. Learning is a big part of any organizational change as well.
Cool. And I'm really curious to know your perspective on this is why the pace of change has accelerated in recent years. So we can't get a head around one change and we are on to the another one. So why this is happening? What's going on in the business environment that's causing this?
So, I mean, change has always been with us. It's been with us, since the early Greeks. It's not a new thing, change. I think what's happening now is that change is accelerating, particularly because of developments within technology and particularly AI, artificial intelligence, innovations that are happening too. So there's much more of a need to keep up with developments, and these AI developments are happening faster and faster. Um, so I think that's a real key driver. There's also, in terms of, if you look at the global political element at the moment, so there are geopolitical issues that are happening across the globe, whether that's conflicts in different parts of the world, or it is some of the issues that are coming out of the states, such as on tariffs, etc. Then that is driving change as well. And likewise, I think since the pandemic, there has been a reframing of what people expect and how they expect to work in the workplace too. So I think that is driving change as well.
What's your advice on how can we really keep up with these changes, according to you?
I think, first of all, the organizations need to be cognizant of what the external and internal triggers are for change. So it's not about change just for the sake of change. It's about recognizing when there's a need for change, what's driving that, and why, what's the rationale for the change is important too.
Okay. And I think that's a good way to transition into our book that I want to deep dive into. So, you've written a book about people-centric organizational change. So, could you explain specifically what does people-centric change management really mean in practice?
What does it mean in practice? Okay, so what it means is first of all, there needs to be a balance. So any planned change, and there are different types of change. So change can be planned, and we can sit down, we can look at what needs to be done, when it needs to be done, who will be involved in it, how long it's going to take, and so on. There's also emergent change, which emerges unexpectedly. So the pandemic, for example, is a key emergent change. We couldn't plan for it. I mean, one day I was teaching in the class, the next day I was teaching via Zoom. So that's emergent change. So when we are talking about planned transformational change, there is a need to have, yes, a process, but that needs to be balanced by a focus on people. And people-centric change is all about ensuring that the right key stakeholders are engaged with a change, often before it even becomes a change, right from the start, when there is a need to look at what could be done differently, what needs to be improved in an organization itself. That's vital. And it's also about recognizing about how can key people be involved in the decision making. How can people that are involved in the work that they're doing actually be given the space to share any ways of improving what they're doing, be more innovative in what they are doing as well.
Interesting. And then, what are some key factors that influence how individuals engage with change?
Yeah, so I think what is important when it comes to engagement with change is, first of all, for managers to be open to engaging relevant stakeholders, and not just internal stakeholders, but also external stakeholders as well too. So it's getting the right people around the table that's important. And clearly that can't be done with, if you have an organization of hundreds of staff, you can't involve everyone. So it is about identifying who are the key people that will be influenced by any change, who will be impacted by it as well, and who can have a say and who will bring some ideas to the table as well. That's important. And often the frontline staff who are doing the job, they have ideas about what can be improved and what can be done differently as well. So it's about people-centric change is about, first of all, being open to engaging people with change. It is important, though, a caveat that I always say is I completely recognize that sometimes change has to happen and people can't be engaged. And that may be pandemic hitting, for example. It may be if there are government rules and regulations that have to be put in to play. So what I'm saying is whenever it's feasible to do so, It's about engaging people, identifying the key stakeholders, getting them involved right from the beginning, as early as possible, even in terms of coming up with ideas, for example, the idea creation about what could be done differently, or how a key opportunity or a key challenge can be addressed that's facing a team or a company itself too.
Right. You also mentioned in the book like some factors that might affect them engaging in the change. For example, the previous experience of the change. So, do you want to elaborate on what are the some factors that might affect the engagement, for example?
Yeah, I mean, if people are working in a culture where this is new to them and they haven't been involved before in being part of change, then obviously they may be a bit concerned about why they're suddenly being asked. So it's creating a what's called a psychologically safe environment. It's a concept that has been widely written about by Amy Edmondson at Harvard University. And that's not about creating a cozy environment. It's about creating an environment where people can raise their concerns, their issues. It's creating an environment where people can be challenged about some of their views, but they feel safe to do so without feeling that they will be told off or their job might be at risk, etc. It's also about creating an environment that it's okay to learn from failure, and that's important. So when failure occurs, it's about thinking about what could be done differently, what have we learned from this so that we don't make the same mistakes again. That's important.
Nice. And according to your experience, what are the key elements that needed to build a great culture in an organization?
Oh, that depends. I would say that depends on the type of organization it is. I mean, it is about trust. Trust is vital in any culture, about building a trust where there's openness, where there's honesty, where there's benevolence, where there's transparency as well. That's absolutely vital.
Okay. And what would you say, like, what are the most effective ways to engage stakeholders during the change process?
Well, it's about identifying who the key stakeholders are. It's about looking at who has the capabilities, who has the capacity to be involved. It's also about identifying the people that are energetic and willing to be part of it. So these are the advocates, getting them on board as quickly as possible, but also getting people involved who may have different views, challenging views as well. That is vital, and giving them being clear on what their role is in the change process. So that means putting some guardrails in place about what's negotiable and what's non-negotiable. So what is it that people can focus on changing and what's not up for negotiation? So that may be, things like the overall mission of the organization or the strategy of the company, like that. So it's giving people some guardrails in which they are being part of, engaged in the change too.
What can we do as change managers to engage them? So, for example, I think you mentioned storytelling in terms of how do we communicate with them. What are the other things that we could do as change managers?
Well, I think it's about fostering collaboration. It's about getting people on board and fostering collaboration. So that in terms of your question you asked before about the culture, it's creating culture of trust, creating a culture of collaboration. It is about fostering ownership so people feel that they're part of the change, because research shows when people participate early in a change, they're much more likely to ensure that the change is sustained and the benefits from it are realized as well too.
Okay. And you also mentioned, like in the book, when we get resistance, it's more to or opposition to seeing that as an opportunity. So, what's your advice on how can we really communicate effectively for those who are resistant to change? How can we deal with them
Well, I
particularly?
think
Because
first of all, it's recognizing that resistance is a label that we give to people because we see them react in a certain way. And often there's a reason why people will oppose change. It may be because they haven't been given enough information about why the change is happening. They don't know the rationale for it. They may not know what the impact is going to be on them. It may be because they have thought of a better way of making changes, but nobody's actually asked them about it. Or it could be because they've got a whole lot of competing commitments, so are really concerned about how do they fit any more work, any more change into the work that they do. So I think it's about understanding why people react as they do, and that involves managers having conversations with their staff to find out what's their perspective. Why are they behaving the way that they are behaving? Because usually there is a reason why people will oppose a change. Often nobody asks them why they're behaving in that way. So it's about getting their perspective that's important.
Interesting. And there's just this one thing comes to mind during change, right? There's like a change graph where everyone goes through change differently. Some might be happy at the start, some might be sad. With so many hundreds of frontline staff, hundreds of like 50 managers, etc. So how can we make sure that everyone comes along with that journey to happiness at the end of the change?
Yeah, I don't know. I think what you're referring to is that there have been things like the change curve, like for instance the
Yes.
Kubler-Ross change curve that says that people go through certain stages, and that's right. There's also the William Bridges transition curve that says
Okay.
that people go through those stages. I think what's most important, rather than getting hooked up on all of these different curves and models, is to recognize that often leaders and managers will be at a different stage and will have accepted a change before frontline staff. So if a leader is announcing a change to frontline staff, it may be the first time these frontline staff have heard about it. So the leader may accept it, they may have taken it on board, whereas frontline staff, it may be quite a shock for them. Yeah, so they will react differently. So it's appreciating that. People will also react differently depending on their experience of change. So if they've had an experience of change that hasn't gone well and has impacted negatively on their role, that's going to stay with them. They'll remember that. Whereas people who've been involved in successful change, again, they'll have a different perspective of change itself too. So I think leaders and managers need to recognize not everybody will be accepting and at the same stage as they are when a change is announced, in fact. Because change, as I write in the book, change is an emotional process. Yeah, it impacts people's emotions. It impacts how they feel about their work. It impacts how they feel about how the change will affect the work that they do. It impacts how they feel about how they will have to change their behavior as well. And ultimately, that emotional element is about often a business transformation can be quite a scary situation. And let me just
Yeah.
explain what I mean by transformational change compared to emergent change. So not emergent change, incremental change. So incremental change is step-by-step change. It's happening all around us all the time. It's often when people refer to continuous change, they're referring to incremental change. Sometimes we're not even cognizant of it happening around us. It's often known as Kaizen, so step-by-step change. There's also what's called transformational change, and transformational change tends to hit the deep structure of the organization. So that's the overall, maybe the mission, the vision, the overall strategy, the structure. A transformational change may be a change in the overall structure or a team structure, for example. It may be a merger or an acquisition or something like that. And that's the type of change that needs to have a real focus on the people element of it. That's the type of change that absolutely there needs to be engagement with key stakeholders in that as well, because that a transformational change can go on for months, sometimes years, in fact, but certainly over months it can go on for.
So can you maybe think of a time where you saw that they managed opposition of change or resistance to change very well that you can think of?
I mean, there's a case that has been written in the book on the People-Centric Change book, which I would highly recommend that people read. That's a really good way of doing it. I mean, the best companies I've seen that deal with opposition to change are the ones that, first of all, recognize that opposition is there, and often that there's a reason for it, and they're willing to actually talk to people about why they feel the way they do, why they're reacting the way that they do. And usually people will come up with, when they're asked, it's a bit like giving people the opportunity to voice their opinions, but importantly, not just voice them, it's to be listened to and to be heard as well. Now, I recognize there may be people in organizations who are just stubborn and will not change and will, oppose change for whatever reason, and there's no rationality behind it. So that may be a performance management issue. That's something different. Where people are coming up with rational reasons why they're reacting as they do, it's about them being heard, and it's about these reasons being acknowledged. And if possible, if there's things that can be done about it, it is about taking action to address the issues that are being raised.
So, in order to manage a more confident business transformation, what are the core capabilities managers need to develop? Because the same skill set that managers have won't be sufficient to manage a successful change. So, what's your advice? What are the core capabilities needed now for managers to
Well,
develop?
I think that often we talk about capabilities, and by capabilities, I mean the skills, the knowledge, experience of what's required for managing change of being separate to the capabilities that are needed for managers. But actually, part of being a manager is being able to facilitate change. And in the book, I do talk about reframing the role of managers. So moving managers' role away from a command and control traditionalist approach to being much more a facilitative approach of coaching, of engaging people with change too. So it's the capabilities that are required for that. And these capabilities are all about communication, coaching skills. They're about listening, summarizing, asking really good questions. They're about being able to deal with what's important, deal with the complexity of change as well, because transformational change can be chaotic, it can be complex. So
Yeah.
being able to deal with ambiguity, because again, a transformational change, when it starts, it's not just a linear process going from A to B. There are things that can impact on that transformation process that can send it off in a different direction. So it's the ability to actually manage that complexity. But it's also important to manage the people element. And that means making sure that people's well-being is taken care of, because any organizational transformation the potential to impact negatively on individuals' well-being. So it's making sure that any transformation is not going to have a negative impact on people's well-being.
Interesting. And you also mentioned like the one of the core capabilities is compassion. Why do you think compassion is important for managers to develop?
Well, that goes back to managers just understanding why people react as they do, why change can sometimes be really scary for some people, because people may feel that they don't have the skills to be able to implement the change effectively. They may be scared about what it means in terms of their relationships with working with people they've worked with for a number of years. So it's just being, in particular, I'd say it's being empathetic towards. Yeah.
Yeah. And the final question before we wrap up is in your last chapter, you talk about the people-centric strategy. So if you could deep dive on the key elements of business transformation framework, and also like why other frameworks like ATCAR, which is quite famous, is a more like a linear approach. So I would love your perspective on these two questions.
Okay, so there's lots of frameworks out there for managing change, lots of them, and these frameworks tend to be based on a linear approach. So if you do this step and this step and this step, then you'll have successful change. A lot of these models also come from a top-down perspective as well. And also, a number of these models are out of date, so they're no longer fit for purpose for the the environment we're now all working in and the changes in the workplace, but also the changes that are happening in terms of organizational transformations themselves. So based on my research, what I have developed is a cyclical approach, because sometimes when you are managing transformational change, one stage and you have to go back round. So that overall, I call it the business transformation cycle, and it is based on, as I say, empirical evidence, which a number of other models are not based. They're very much commercial products. And these steps, just at a high level, range. First of all, it's about understanding the external and internal context. So, what's triggering change, but particularly looking at not just the challenges and the threats, but what are the opportunities? Because the important thing is change often gets bad press, but change should add value. Change should also be linked to being innovative within an organization. The next step is about developing and clarifying the rationale of the case for the transformation. So, work that I have done with global organizations when I have been brought in to work with them on developing their own approach to change. One of the key aspects that often comes to the fore about why people oppose or don't get change or not engaged in it is because they don't understand the why, the rationale for the change itself. So, it's having the clarity on that. It's about connecting and engaging with stakeholders, which we've talked about. But it's also about developing empirical based data on which to base the change interventions. A number of business transformations will often occur because it's the latest fad or fashion.
Right.
What I'm talking about is that any transformational change, there has to be some data that supports it. And there's a number of ways that this can be done using different approaches. It's about assessing readiness for change, because there has to be people within the organization have to be ready for change. They have to be willing, they have to be able to deal with it. And this is so important because within any organization, there's never just one change happening at a time. It's never just one incremental change. There's often a number of incremental changes, but also more and more these days, a number of transformational changes happening too. So it's about being able to assess it and then to develop and deliver and design evidence-based transformational interventions too. And then putting in place what's needed to support the implementation of change. If people and managers are engaged early in this cycle, it means that when it comes to implementation, it's not a surprise, it's not a shock to them, because they have been involved throughout the transformation process. And any transformation has to be evaluated too. And evaluation measures, whether they're KPIs, key performance indicators, have to be identified right at the start of any transformation process. That is absolutely vital. And it's about embedding the changes within the organization. And that means about ensuring that the benefits that have been identified are actually realized. And these benefits stick within the organization. Because what can often happen is that people will go back to their old ways of working and of behaving. Now, the business transformation cycle that I have developed is there's no surprises to what would be in that. But what makes this unique and different is that there are a number of key principles that underpin this business transformation cycle. And these key principles are build engagement, which we've been talking about, fostering collaboration, so getting opportunities where people can get together to share ideas, to share their hopes, their concerns, etc. And that collaboration can be done internally, but can also be done externally as well. So it's important that external stakeholders are involved. It's about encouraging dialogue. So yes, for any transformational change, there needs to be communication. But in this era of communication coming at us from all angles, it's about not forgetting we need to have conversations. And a 5-minute conversation can actually be really powerful and provide a lot of data compared to trying to wing emails back and forward about an issue. And dialogue is, I think it's vital. We need to get into the habit of having more conversations again, either online or in person. Another key principle is about promoting reflection and inquiry. So change is also about learning. So we need to learn more from our transformations. Anything that goes well, but also anything that doesn't go so well, anything that fails, and to share that across teams, share it across the organization, so that these, issues that failed are not going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Three more principles. One is about stimulating innovation. So as I say, change needs to add value, it needs to involve innovation too. So let's get, people to share their thoughts and their views. And then the other principle is about enhancing well-being. And this is a key topic, isn't it? But running a yoga class on a Wednesday afternoon is great, but it's not going to really get to the heart of people's well-being and how change impacts on their stress levels. It's really important at the start of any transformation process to think about, okay, what's being proposed here? What can we do to ensure that it's going to impact effectively and positively on people's well-being? And then finally, it's about developing managers and teams so that they have not just the capability, but they have the capacity to deal with transformations as well.
Amazing, Julian. That's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll link your book in the show notes. And I want to let your listeners know that if you want to deep dive into what Julie said today, everything is in this book in much more detail. And I'll link Julie's social media handles in the show notes as well. And also to our listeners, make sure you comment below on YouTube if you're listening to this on YouTube, like what's the biggest takeaway from this episode. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you once again, Julie.
Thank you.